I'm going to talk to you about the art of asking questions. At first, you might feel this topic is beneath you. I'm in high school. I know how to ask questions, derp derp derp, you might be saying to yourself. But the truth is that asking meaningful questions, questions that enable critical thinking or deep class discussion, is not easy, and it's not something you've ever been trained in. So put aside your prejudice about this topic for now, and let's explore the subject. The first thing to know about asking questions is that interest plays an important role. Why? People who are interested in a subject ask questions about it. People who aren't interested don't say anything. I mean, why would you ask a question about a subject if you don't care? You wouldn't. It goes without saying then that the first step of asking meaningful questions is to get yourself interested in the topic. You have to increase your own level of interest. But wait, you say, interest is an emotion. I can't control whether or not I experience an emotion. Actually, that's not true at all. I won't go off on a long tangent about the connection between thought and emotion in this presentation, but I will point out a few tricks you can use to become interested in any subject. The first trick is to identify one tiny little aspect of a subject that interests you, just the tiniest little speck of interest, and focus on that one aspect to enable you to ask a question. You'll be amazed how well this trick works because people are naturally curious, and there are very few things in the world that are completely disinteresting to us. A quick note here, this trick also works well for people you don't like. Find just one thing to admire about the person, and you'll find it much easier to get along with him or her. Another trick to increase your interest and ask a question is to see a connection between the subject and your own life and experiences. Sometimes the connections are obvious. Sometimes they're not obvious at all. But if you take a good, honest look for connections, the chances are you'll find them and be able to ask a question. The next trick is a great one for those of you who like to rock the boat, who want to challenge others or be different. Who says you have to ask the question in a normal way? Don't be afraid to be weird or be contrary. It's perfectly fine to ask something like, if the main character was a flavor of ice cream, what flavor would she be? It's also okay to ask a question in an attempt to disprove an idea. You can say something like, the author is trying to say that government is out to get us. Do we really believe that? That's a great question for discussion. Sometimes the tricks I've given you so far won't work, but you'll notice that someone else is enthusiastic about the subject. Humans have a very interesting ability. It's called empathy, and it means that we can experience the emotions of others. You might have noticed this if you've ever been to a funeral of someone you didn't know very well. That person's close friends and family are sad and distressed, and we feel it a bit too, even though we don't have the same level of direct loss. Well, this works for positive emotions as well. So when you're discussing a subject, find the person in the room who is most interested and focus on that person. You'll see that their enthusiasm rubs off on you. And for my final trick to raising your interest level enough to ask questions, I'm going to give you a last-ditch solution. If nothing else works, fake it. Pretend you're interested. See yourself as an actor, as someone else who is actually interested. What you'll find when you do this is that you will become interested enough to ask questions. And that brings me to my final point about the relationship between interest and questions. The simple act of asking questions will raise your interest. And then because you're interested, you ask more questions. It's an upward spiral, and it's lots of fun when it happens. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to start asking questions, let's talk about the types of questions you can ask. For our purposes, we're going to lump questions into 3 categories based on what type of information they seek. The first category is what we call comprehension questions. A comprehension question seeks to establish a basic understanding of the subject. These are the who, what, where, when questions. These questions are generally pretty easy to answer and don't require much critical thinking. The second category of questions is evaluative questions. An evaluative question wants to know the value of something. Is it valuable or important? How valuable or important is it? Do we like it? Do we hate it? Is it true? Is it a lie? These are evaluative questions. and these can be much harder to answer than comprehension questions because they ask us to compare the subject against other subjects or our own experiences and thoughts. Evaluative questions definitely require critical thinking. Finally, we have the third category of questions, interpretive questions. Interpretive questions seek insight or deep understanding of the subject. Often these are questions of how or why something is as it is. Interpretive questions are rarely easy to answer, and they often have us reviewing material for evidence to support our ideas. These are great questions for discussion and require tons of critical thinking to answer. So now I've given you these categories, but I don't feel like that's enough to throw you into a class discussion and have you ask questions in each category. The missing ingredient for this recipe is some examples. Let's imagine we have a text and the female protagonist is named Morgan. I like that name. Don't steal it for your future children. Anyway, an example of a comprehension question would be, who is Morgan dating? This would be a pretty easy question to answer. There's not much critical thinking involved as long as we understood the text. If we move to an evaluative question on the same subject, we could ask something like, should Morgan be dating Richard? Aha! Now this is a tougher question. It's asking for our judgment of Richard. To answer it, we would base that judgment on evidence from the text, how other characters seem to feel about Richard, and our own personal bias. Thus you can see how an evaluative question starts to activate critical thinking and can easily lead to meaningful discussion. And finally, we have an interpretive question. Why is Morgan dating Richard? Now that might seem like an easy question at first. You could just say, well, she likes him. But the question is deeper than that, because a single person could like a lot of other people without dating them all. Why this one? Why Richard? Does he represent something to her that others do not? What if we found in the story that Richard is abusive? That changes the question a lot, doesn't it? And to answer this question, we're going to have to scour the text for evidence. And it's very possible that we'll find limited evidence or evidence that doesn't directly answer the question. That requires us to interpret the evidence to find an answer. And that's why interpretive questions are called interpretive questions. We have to find and interpret evidence to answer them, and that takes some heavy lifting, some deep critical thinking. I want to pause a moment to handle a misconception that you might have, that asking a comprehension question is bad. It isn't. Comprehension questions are a great way to start off a discussion because they ensure that you and others understand the subject. And because they're generally easy to answer, someone is going to answer you. Let's face it, it's not a discussion if no one is saying anything. But once the basics of a subject are established, you want to dive deeper and spice things up with evaluative and interpretive questions. Right, we've talked about interest, we've talked about the types of questions you can ask. I want to bring up another thing to consider when framing your questions, and that is, be specific. A lot of times, students ask questions that are too big too early. I really find that discussions and understanding are better achieved when you narrow the focus of your questions. Let me explain by way of example. When I hold a class discussion to a class I haven't trained, I frequently get the person who throws out this question right at the beginning of a discussion. What is the meaning of the text? Now, if you ever want to kill the discussion, this is the surefire method. The student asks the question and nothing happens. Everyone kind of looks at each other, praying that someone else will answer, but no one does. You see, it's too big a question. Yes, it's an important one, but no, it's not wrong to ask it at some point. But to start a discussion with it, you'd be better off stabbing your classmates in the eye with your eraser. You'd get a more meaningful reaction. Here's an example of a better, more specific question for early in a discussion. What does the author mean when he writes blank? You see, this is much more manageable. We can all look at the same line. It probably doesn't require us to digest the text as a whole. It's a great starting point for critical thinking, and likely, when the question about overall meaning gets asked later, our answer to this specific question will help us answer it. So keep in mind that while broad questions are important, you're generally going to get more mileage out of specific questions, especially early on in a discussion. Okay, we're right up to the end here, and I want to talk about a few ways you can add seasoning to your questions. How can you make them just a little bit more meaningful? Why? Well, no one likes bland food. We like things spicy. Your first spice is vocabulary. Now, before you roll your eyes, I don't necessarily mean big words when I say vocabulary. I mean colorful words. Yes, vocabulary is an option, but so is slang. Just be careful not to be offensive in your word choice. And let's not forget that figurative language, similes, metaphors, hyperboles, can make questions more flavorful too. Here's an example of advanced vocabulary spicing up a question. Why is Richard being so facetious? Now you say that word in a class, and you'll see everyone looking around at each other. Feces what? They're thinking. Facetious. It means treating serious things not seriously. Similar to being sarcastic, but not quite the same. The point here is that you got everybody's attention by throwing in that one word. For slang, we can ask, does Richard see Morgan as just another thought? Now, you'll get a chuckle from some of your classmates with that one, but it's actually a great question. If there's a better word to express what a thought is than thought, I don't know that I've ever run across it, and I've been studying English for years. But it's also great because it evokes something of Richard's psychology. Maybe Richard uses this word in the text, or his friends do. Using the slang really spices up the question. For figurative language, I'm also going to build in a cultural reference. Is Richard Morgan's kryptonite? I think you'll agree that that's an interesting way to phrase that question. It's both a metaphor and a cultural reference, and if you ask the question in that way in a class, you'll definitely have everybody's attention. Now, vocabulary is not your only spice. Controversy is also very tasty. When you're framing your questions, why not be a little contrary? Why not explore an idea that you know won't be overly popular at first? Even if people reject it, it doesn't mean they didn't learn anything in the process of rejecting it. Let's take a look at two examples. Example the first. Why should women's rights matter to Richard? Now, if you're a female hearing that question, you're probably going to have a reaction. But it is a valid question. Why should Richard care? He's a man. He's a bad boy. Is there any reason he should give a damn about Morgan's rights? A question like this can generate good discussion. But you can go even further, delve into offensive land a bit. You don't think Morgan deserved to get slapped? Now, if the ladies in the class reacted a bit before, they're staring death lasers at you right now. But again, it's a valid question. Is it not possible that Morgan did something to provoke her boyfriend? Just because she's a woman and she got slapped, that does not mean she played some role in the dispute. It does not mean that she didn't play a role in the dispute. So you see, while these won't be popular questions in some ways, they are both quite meaningful. Okay, let's talk about your last spice, perspective. When you read a story, view a painting, watch a movie, or listen to a song, you can adopt many different viewpoints to ask questions. You have your own viewpoint as you. You have the viewpoint of another member of the audience, someone male, someone female, someone from another culture, etc. You have the viewpoint of the creator. You have the viewpoint of the characters, and you even have the viewpoint of other creators or critics. You can generate some great questions by stepping outside of yourself and exploring some of these other viewpoints. Please keep that in mind. That brings us to the end of this presentation. I know it was rather long-winded at times, especially for a subject that you thought you knew so well, but I hope you've got something out of it. You will need this information to assist you with asking questions in class because we'll be scoring you on it. So feel free to review this video, the slides, and the transcript as many times as you need. Thank you.